Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And as always on a Tuesday, glad to welcome Alfred University history professor, longtime history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Gary, thank you for calling in.
Hey, a pleasure. I'm here in Olean today, and cloudy day, of course, but glad to be here.
Gary, this is one of those days where both the left and the right, both the conservatives and the liberals, are in agreement. No more starting out with Iowa. Disaster last night in Iowa. What do you make of it all?
I think for a change, maybe the conservatives and the liberals are on the right path here. Look, I mean, Iowa is in many, many ways very, very unrepresentative of at least the Democratic Party. I mean, Democrats today in the United States contain a very, very significant number of African Americans, a significant number of Latinos, large numbers of elderly, young people, of course, and the Iowa caucus does not reflect all of that. Iowa is 90% white. It is, in many ways, in that sense, unrepresentative of the party generally. And so, because it's the very, very first primary / caucus, it gets an outsized importance. I think what's happened now has really discredited the Iowa system. Now, I may be wrong about this, but I do think that in 2024, Iowa goes to a primary system. So all of this hand-wringing, all of this criticism and whatnot may be somewhat irrelevant, within 4 years. But right now, we got a system that just does not work very well. It's very complicated. My understanding is that if, let's say, you are a Democrat in Iowa and you go to one of these caucuses, okay, you initially cast a ballot for the person that you would like to get the Democratic nomination, but then you're asked, I think what happens is that if your candidate does not get 15% of the vote, then that kind of disappears entirely from that district in the caucus, so that the votes having been cast for that individual are not going to be in the total that will be reflected the following day. And so you get a situation where, and again, this is partial information. I don't think that we really fully know what happened yesterday. But if, let's say, Bernie Sanders gets, let's say, 30% of the vote, and Elizabeth Warren gets 15% of the vote in a particular district, you get a situation where, because of some of these complicated rules having to do with the 15% rule and so forth, they may wind up both with the same number of delegates to the Democratic Convention in Milwaukee this summer, or, as I say, in another situation, there may be no votes cast whatsoever for Elizabeth Warren. And it's not just, those two candidates. Obviously, there are a number of other people involved. What does appear to be the case at this early point is that Joe Biden did much, much worse than people had anticipated. And in some ways, the confusion may actually help him, because we may not take the Iowa results very seriously. But, that remains to be seen. In either case, I think it is a mess. I think there's one other point I would want to make about the Iowa caucus. There are a lot of people who might be Democrats who would want to participate in these caucuses, but who cannot. For instance, if you are a babysitter, you're not going to be able, if you have children at home, you have to be at home. You can't go to the caucus. If you're disabled, you're probably not going to be able to go to the caucus. There are a lot of other categories, too, where the caucus is not going to be really inclusive. And consequently, I don't think that any of us should take the Iowa caucus too seriously.
Yeah, just looking at the headlines, Matt Drudge's page, the Drudge Report, chaos in Iowa from the Huffington Post. App Apocalypse, the Democratic firm that botched the Iowa caucus, and they say the company's name is Shadow. Here's another headline from Huffington Post. First in the nation fiasco, still no results.
Well, imagine that you are any one of these candidates, and imagine that you have just spent about 2 to 3 months in Iowa, and imagine also that you've poured millions upon millions of dollars in Iowa, and we now do not know who won the Iowa caucus, and not only that, we may not fully know who really won the Iowa caucus. It's a waste of time. And I should also add that there have been people who have won the Iowa caucus in past years who have gone nowhere when it came to the actual nominating convention. So I think, if I may be right, at one point Rick Santorum won the Republican caucus in Iowa. I think maybe Pat Buchanan either won, or maybe it wasn't Pat Buchanan, or came in second or something like that. So I don't think that any of us should take the Iowa caucus too seriously. Unfortunately, we're not the people who make that decision. It's the political professionals, of course, and up to this point, yeah, they have taken it very seriously. Maybe they won't in the future.
One thing that some of the conservative websites that I've seen this morning are speculating that this would help, this plan that conservatives are suspicious about, both the talk shows and the conservative writers. Not everybody, but there is a suspicion out there that Hillary Clinton is going to be brought in at the last minute to win the Democrat nomination. What do you make of that?
I think it's poppycock. I think it's just hogwash. I'm not sure why, and I think that someone may eventually do a study of this kind of thing. Why conservatives are somewhat more prone to conspiracy kind of thinking than our liberals. But in either case, that has been the case, and we can certainly trace that back well into the 19th century, certainly to the 1830s, the 1850s, when people were so fearful about Catholic immigration and that the Pope was going to move to the United States and that the Catholics would take over this country and whatnot. If people want to consider that, if they want to be conspiratorial, if they want to imagine the worst, a catastrophe, kind of a political catastrophe, I suppose it's a free country. They're certainly free to do that. But I certainly would not want to take very seriously the idea that Hillary Clinton is going to become the Democratic nominee. I would say that there's one chance in 10,000 that that's going to happen. It's not going to happen.
You're right, Gary, about the conservatives being more suspicious. This morning, the Washington Examiner has a headline: "The Iowa caucus disaster can partly be blamed on Hillary Clinton's former campaign manager." And it goes on to talk about somebody named Mook, Robbie Mook. So you have a point, Gary.
Well, let me tell you about a poll that I did find of some interest to myself, and that might be of some interest to folks who are listening to this program right now. I teach history at Alfred University, and in 2 of my classes yesterday, I asked students who did they think might become the Democratic. No, I didn't. I know that wasn't quite the question. The question I asked was, who did they think would be the best candidate to become president of the United States in the election of 2020? There are Republicans there are Democrats. I'm sure some of the kids were independents and so forth. 63 students voted, and they did so anonymously. In other words, they cast a paper ballot. They did not put their name on the ballot. The only other information I asked was for them to indicate whether or not they are male or female, so that when the ballots came in, I'd know whether a ballot for, let's say, Donald Trump came from a young man or a young woman. And the results I found to be kind of interesting. Okay, now there are 63 kids who voted. Of those 63, 17 of them indicated that they would vote for Donald Trump, that they would think he should be president. Of those 17, only 4 were female. So think about that. 17 out of 63. That's a little bit less than 30%, if I have my math right. Bernie Sanders had 19 votes rather than 17, relatively close to Trump, a tiny bit more, but about half were female and half were male. Elizabeth Warren had 8 votes out of the 63. Mayor Pete and Amy Klobuchar had 0 each. No one voted for them. In other words, they are just kind of invisible, at least to the students in my class at Alfred University. Andrew Yang, 3 votes, all male students. And here's the most interesting single thing, I think, in the ballot that I sent out there. Joe Biden only got 2 votes out of the 63 students. Both of them were from male students. 11 students said they had no choice at all. It may mean that they were just uninterested or they don't follow politics or something along those lines. And then I had 3 students who said, we'll support anyone but Donald Trump. But needless to say, the point here is that, kind of like Iowa, things seem to be very, very much divided. And Bernie seems to have a little bit of an edge in all of this, but the Biden numbers, I think, if I were if I were Biden's campaign advisor and I saw what happened at Alfred University yesterday, I would be plenty concerned.
Just reading the president's Twitter message from this morning. The Democrat caucus is an unmitigated disaster. Nothing works just like the way they ran the country. Remember the $5 billion Obamacare website that should have cost 2% of that? The only person that can claim a very big victory last night is Trump. That's what President Trump said.
Well, look, I mean, President Trump is President Trump. His supporters say, he tells it like it is. Well, he doesn't tell it like it is. I mean, here's a guy who thought that the Kansas City Chiefs were located in Kansas City, Kansas, not Kansas City, Missouri. Here's a guy who talked about building the border wall in Colorado. Here's a guy who cannot tell the difference between the Baltics, that's Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia, and the Balkans, that, of course, meaning, Bosnia and Serbia and Montenegro. Here's a guy who thinks that Belgium, who calls Belgium a beautiful city. Well, of course, 99% of us know that Belgium is a country and not a city. And not only that, and I've made this point before on this program, the president doesn't tell the truth very often. The Washington Post fact checker, who keeps a really, really good record of this, notes that now, after roughly 3 years in office, President Trump has uttered over 15,000 either comments that are flatly false, lies, okay, or else that are misleading. So, to think that this man, really tells it like it is just fantasy. He may tell it like it is because he insults people in a way that presidents have never done in the past. He may, say things that are impolitic, and I think that certainly his comment about the Iowa caucuses is certainly impolitic, even more so about the Democrats generally. But, he does not tell it like it is. And the really important element of that is not the fact that the president lies. I mean, everyone lies a little bit. Hillary Clinton certainly probably lied 25% of the things she said during the campaign in 2016. But that compares to about 65 to 70% of the things that Donald Trump said that weren't true. But more importantly, what I would say as a historian is that democracies, okay, a free country, a democracy cannot live without the truth, okay? If you don't have press freedom, if you don't have, real, genuine truth, a democracy will die. And I think our democracy is in trouble because of the character of the President of the United States.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, the longtime history professor of Alfred University. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get to this day in history.
Are you more than $10,000 in debt? Feel like you're on a never-ending treadmill, staying in one place and never getting ahead with those minimum payments? Don't let the credit card companies bully you anymore. There are programs in place to help you get free of your debt, and you don't have to pay the entire amount you owe. The program at Total Financial Freedom can help you get debt-free in months instead of decades. Call Total Financial now at 800-899-8922. That's 800-899-8922.
Ready to create your own income with your own home-based business where there's no such thing as getting laid off? If a billionaire entrepreneur spent 5 years and $20 million searching for the next big trend, wouldn't you want to know what he found? If you're serious about making money from home without having to leave home, then write this down. www.goherenext.com. You decide your income. Get the facts now. GoHereNext.com.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn, who says it's going to get stormy. You talking rain or snow, Rob?
little bit of snow, a little bit of rain, depends on what you like. You could see it. We've got kind of a battle, Brian, between cold up across the high plains. It's below zero this morning in the Dakotas. Later today, Florida is going to be up near 80. In between, a big wedge of moisture coming out of the Gulf of Mexico through the Tennessee River Valley and right across central New York State. And that boundary is going to kind of waver back and forth the next couple of days. Occasionally will be mild, some days will be cold, and this is probably going to continue next 2 weeks, believe it or not. Brian, for today, a lot of cloudiness before the day is done. We may see a shower or two. Highs 40 to 45. Sunrise this morning was at 7:22, and the sun's going to set tonight at 5:29. Now, tonight we'll see some showers, but as it gets colder overnight, cold air starts to slip in. Showers will change to snow showers with 25 to 30. Tomorrow we're in the cold air, lots of clouds, a high of only 30 to 35. Warmer weather starts to push back our way with another wave of low pressure tomorrow night. Snow, sleet, and freezing rain developing, changing to rain, any accumulations under an inch. A low tomorrow night of 25, but temperatures go up. And then for Thursday, rainy, breezy, 45 to 50. We're back in the cold air Friday. There could be some snow near 30, and then turns partly sunny and chilly for Saturday, Brian.
On with Dr. Gary Ostrower. It was on this day in history, Dr. Ostrower, 1962, February 4th, 1962, that the first U.S. helicopter was shot down in Vietnam. History Channel's website said it was one of 15 helicopters ferrying South Vietnamese Army troops into battle near, I believe I'm saying this correctly, Hong Mai.
Well, I don't know very much about that particular battle, but I certainly know, and I'm a little surprised that the first helicopter was not shot down even earlier. You know, the French had colonized Vietnam for many, many years, roughly since about 1875. And then they fought a war, an 8-year war against the Vietnamese. This is following World War II, because the Vietnamese abandoned their independence and the French wanted to maintain their colonial empire. And finally, at a really, really important battle in 1954, in May of 1954, the French lost. Okay, the battle was called Dien Bien Phu. The French, the Vietnamese, I should say, brought a cannon, they brought artillery, they brought their manpower and so forth to positions high up on some bluffs. The French were down in a valley. The French did not possibly believe that the Vietnamese could do what, in fact, the Vietnamese wound up doing. The Vietnamese laid siege to Dien Bien Phu, this French base, and ultimately about somewhere between 10 and 15,000 French soldiers were either killed or made prisoners of war. They surrendered, of course, and that was the final battle in that war. So you had a Western industrialized country fighting what was essentially a third world, very, very non-industrialized society, and Vietnam got its independence. Vietnam was then divided between the North, which was communist under Ho Chi Minh, and the South, which was non-communist, under a president by the name of Diem. And that remained the case for the next 6 or so years. In fact, the war had ended, that French war had ended with the expectation that there would be free elections and that as a result of the free elections, Vietnam would then be unified either under that government in the North or under that government in the South. What happened, of course, was that the Southerners were fearful that Ho Chi Minh, the Northern communists, would win the election. And consequently, they didn't hold the election. And when they didn't hold the election, the Northerners, the communists, and there were plenty of those communists in the South as well, we call them Viet Cong, which means Vietnamese communists, they began an insurrection. They began what was essentially a revolution. And in 1960, beginning in 1960, the United States began to pour troops into the South. Actually, a little bit before 1960. By the time that President Kennedy became president in January of 1961, there were already 800 U.S. military advisors in Vietnam. And the number of those advisors during the Kennedy administration from 1961 until November of 1963 would increase from approximately 800 to approximately 16,000. And those 16,000, of course, also included helicopter pilots. We sent over many helicopters, and we were thoroughly involved in the war from, as I say, the beginning of 1961 on a growing capacity right until 1963, and then, of course, even further following that. Eventually, in 1968, we had about 540,000 troops, 547,000 to be exact, in Vietnam. It was just a slow build-up and escalation. With every one of those escalations, we thought we would win the war, and with every one of those escalations, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, in a sense, escalated themselves, and consequently, it was just a situation where one side escalated, the other met that escalation, leading to another escalation, just a kind of a situation that became ultimately intolerable for the Americans by 1973.
Dr. Ostrower, the word advisors, now, we're talking about troops, aren't we?
Yeah, sure they are. And they really were advisors, but more than advisors. In other words, these were American soldiers, many of them Green Berets, Army Rangers, who would join with South Vietnamese troops going after the Viet Cong, those guerrillas, those Viet Cong guerrillas in the southern part of Vietnam. Now, on one level, they were really giving advice. On another level, they were fighting. I mean, they were carrying weapons. They were fully involved in the firefights that were occurring between 1961 and 1963. They were ferrying in the South Vietnamese troops into these areas where battles would take place. And when I say ferrying in, I mean on those helicopters, the one, in fact, that was shot down on February 4th of 1962. So, on one level, yeah, they were they're fighting men. On another level, they were, in fact, offering advice, if you will, to the South Vietnamese. And the assumption was that the South Vietnamese would accept this advice because if they did not, presumably, or at least the South Vietnamese were led to believe that the Americans would withdraw their support. And the South Vietnamese knew full well that they could not win this war without American support. As it turned out, they didn't win the war, even though they had the American support.
Down to the last 30 seconds or so, is the word advisors, was that deceptive at the time?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Was the word advisors, was that a deceptive phrase to make it seem like we weren't really in a wartime situation?
No, Brian, I think that they really were. They were both. They were, they were soldiers, fighting that war, but they were also advisors. I mean, they were there to give support to the South Vietnamese, and much of that support was to say, hey, here's the way in which you fight a guerrilla war. The British had won a guerrilla war against communists in the Philippines back in 1946 and 1947, and many of the lessons learned from that conflict were being applied by the Americans to the South Vietnamese within the beginnings of that Vietnam War between 1961 and 1963. So I think that the phrase, the use of the term advisors was accurate, but I think it did not fully describe what the Americans were doing. I think that we were involved in more military action than the American public was led to believe.
Yes, and the phrase sort of indicates that they're trying to come up with a nice spin to put on it. Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, also on this day in history, Dr. Ostrower, the beginning of the Yalta Conference between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. Now, Yalta, I believe, is in Russia. Am I correct?
Well, it was in the Soviet Union.
Okay.
It's actually at that time, it was part of what we would call the Ukraine, which was itself then part of the Soviet Union. Remember, when we say the Soviet Union, it really was a union of about 17 or 18 different states, and that would include states like Kazakhstan and Latvia and so forth, but it also included Ukraine. And at the bottom of Ukraine, sticking, so to speak, jutting out into the Black Sea, was the Crimea. And that's where the Yalta Conference was held. And it was a very, very consequential conference because, among other things, they made decisions having to do with the Soviets entering the Pacific War in 1945 after the war in Europe would end. They made decisions having to do with the character of the government in Poland, things that became very, very contentious after World War II. Brian, I know that we have limited time, and I know that I don't have fully time to go into all the details of it.
Sure.
maybe we can do this in a later program. But yeah, it was a really, really important conference. And I might add, by the way, that it meant the Soviets would not give the Chinese communists aid after 1945, and it also meant that the Soviets and the Americans would both join the United Nations, and that each would have what we call a veto. The Soviets would have 3 separate states that would have a veto. The United States would have 1.
Dr. Ostrower, with that, we should leave it. But as always, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll talk to you next week.